All right, guys, ready for our population and cultural geography test. Same format as our normal test. It'll be 40 multiple choice questions. 5 of them will be mapping, and it goes over everything we've done from urbanization to population pyramids, all the way through our religions unit and culture. So nothing new that you haven't seen before as far as the format. All right, so with urbanization, please remember urbanization is the movement towards city. It's that movement from rural to urban. We see this within our own country. We've seen this globally over the past 150 years, specifically since the Industrial Revolution. But we didn't always have cities. Please remember that we started as a hunting and gathering group of peoples, and until we had domestication, which is that taming of plants and animals, that we started to have a more sedentary lifestyle. We stayed in one place. That agricultural society caused us to move closer to each other so we could trade with each other, creating small villages and then creating our cities. All right, so cities need to be able to do these things to exist. If they do not have these things, they're not going to be successful. They need ports and transportation. Cities need to be located near a large body of water so they can move product in and out. They need to be by highways to be able to get people in and out of the cities. Without those things, they're not going to exist. They need to have industry. They need to create jobs. They need to provide for the needs of the people through government centers. And sometimes cities even have special services that will draw and attract people to the area. With megalopolis is when 2 or more cities have grown together. So you can see on the map to the right, we have cities like Boston, we have cities like New York, Newark, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. And what has happened is continually as these cities have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, it has really just turned into one large urban area. So another word that you need to know is overpopulation. Overpopulation occurs when the resources available cannot meet the needs of the people. It does not mean that there's too many people. Okay, so don't get that mixed up. There's not too many people in a city or in a planet on the planet. It's about the fact that they have exceeded their carrying capacity. They don't have enough resources, whether that be government support, whether that be food, fertile soil for farming. That's when you reach overpopulation. All right, so then let's look at some of the problems and solutions to urban sprawl. This is a lot like your assessment that we did, right? So with urban sprawl, that is when the city is growing outwards. Okay, do not get this confused. This is not urban to rural. It's not people moving out of the cities. It's the cities swelling and getting bigger and bigger. And as they get bigger, people move away from the cities. They want more space and that kind of thing for their families. So that is part of why we have the urban sprawl. All right, so sustainable communities. This is our assessment that we did. You know this stuff, guys. You should know that sustainable means that you are taking care of the needs of the people, but also taking care of the environment. So how do you provide for jobs? How do you provide housing without destroying the land that we live on? So remember things that are going to reduce our use of fossil fuels. We're going to take care of the crops. We're going to space out our cities in a way that we're not wasting our space with things like smart growth, right? And we're recycling and reusing anything that we can and using renewable resources. All right, so let's go over human factors that influence settlement. So these would be things like our pull factors, right? Things that move people to an area. It could also be push factors. So this could be things like jobs that people want to go to a city for. But there could also be push factors from the country that they're coming from. War and conflict can push people out of a place. So settlement patterns can be based on that. It can also be based on proximity, being close to another place of importance, right? So that's why we have more people living in the Northeast, because European settlement was closer to the northeastern United States. Let's see. With physical factors, these are also important with determining where people live. The 3 F's, guys, that we talked about this, people want to live on flat land with fertile soil and fresh water. Those meet some of the basic needs, right? You need to be able to build housing. you need to be able to grow food for people to eat, and you need to have access for fresh water. So we tend to see people around rivers, around large bodies of water, around natural resources so they can make money. Okay. All right, so let's review population pyramids because these are important. We're going to see them a lot on the test, and we're going to see them throughout the rest of the year. So it's really important that you try to figure out how to read these, and then we understand how they work. We click through this. All right, so we see our three basic shapes. We talked about it being the Christmas tree, kind of the house shaped, and then we talked about the kite shaped or the coffin shaped, whatever you wanted to do to remember that last one, the stage 4. Remember stage 2, we have rapid growth. That would be a high birth rate. That first blank is a high birth rate. That's more than 2 per woman. You always find the birth rate on the last 3 or 4 columns of the bar graph on the bottom, right? Because that's where the babies are, right? So if there were more babies being born over the last 15 years, that means that the birth rate is increasing, okay? These are countries like Rwanda and India, countries that have maybe less access to health care and birth control. Okay. When we're looking at this, we see that the largest group of people in stage 2 is the children. So the government is going to try to plan for more schools and education and daycares for the children. Our next stage is stage 3, that's slow growth. We looking at the bottom again, because we always look at the bottom of the population pyramid. We see it starting to be steadied out, right? So there hasn't really been that much change between the 0 to 4-year-olds, the 5 to 9-year-olds, the 10 to 14-year-olds. It tends to be about the same. As countries develop, they kind of move towards this. Countries like the United States. Here we have an average of about 2 per woman. And when we see it here, our largest group is going to be our 15 to 60-year-olds or so. So this is jobs and housing. That is important for that age group. And then our last stage is stage 4. That's negative growth. Here we start to see a slant, a decrease within the birth rate, right? So it's getting smaller at the bottom from year to year. This is birth rates that are below 2 per woman. Countries like Japan and Russia are at stage 4, which is negative growth. And you can see as people are living longer in these countries with all that access to health care, there's a need more for retirement homes. All right, so let's go over population controls and incentives. So just like we were talking about on the last slide, population pyramids are used by governments to help them understand what's going on with their country. So if a country sees that they are rapidly growing their population, they want to try to decrease it. So these are policies that the government might enact to decrease their population. We've seen this in China with their former one-child policy, now the two-child policy. And we saw this through propaganda and different posters that countries will use to try to encourage people to use contraceptives and birth controls and to try to have less children so as not to reach a point of famine and to help them develop economically. Opposite, we see population incentives, right? These are countries that are at negative growth that are concerned about losing their cultural heritage and not having enough workers. So they are trying to increase their population. They do this specifically with providing money or services for people who have children. So they will try to encourage people to have children by paying things like childcare or taking care of some kind of tax deductions. Those kind of things would be considered population incentives. We see this mostly in more developed countries, countries in Europe, and countries like Japan and Korea that have very low birth rates. All right, so let's move into culture. We're going to start with talking about culture with cultural diffusion. So diffusion is the spread of ideas, inventions, or patterns of behavior. So I've put some pictures of some Coke cans. You can see that Coca-Cola is sold worldwide, right? So it is a product that has diffused around the world, right? As American culture has diffused, so has American products. If you look at the bottom to kind of connect this with the biology and with science, right, we see at the bottom right there's a glass with some red dots on one edge, and they have diffused and spread throughout the rest of the water. So that should help you maybe connect that idea of diffusion. It's a movement, it's a spread. So if you can define diffusion in one word, it would be the spread of. All right, let's talk about cultural convergence. Okay, so cultural convergence happens when we have two cultures come together, become more similar, or blend. Okay, so we see this with we saw this with the McDonald's menus. That was really fun, right? We looked at how in other foreign countries they take kind of the cultural influences and blend them with American food. We saw that with kosher restaurants in Israel, where they don't serve cheeseburgers. We saw this with the guacamole in Chile, where they put that on the burgers. Things that are going to see cultural blending, right? America is the great melting pot of different cultures. Those kind of things is where we see similarities, all right? Diffusion takes us to convergence. Convergence is where we start to see the blending of two cultures. All right, cultural divergence is the opposite. It's kind of the opposite, right? So it's not exactly the opposite of convergence where it's two cultures separating, but is when cultures are isolated from another one, either intentionally or unintentionally, right? So we have some examples there at the bottom. The Amish, we saw they separate themselves culturally so as to preserve their religious beliefs, so they can practice their culture without the influence of technology and things that distract them from their faith. We saw within the Aborigines, they are trying to preserve their art and their heritage, so they kind of reject some modern culture in Australia to try to do things their own way. But that's not always the case where it's like they're trying to intentionally preserve their culture. Sometimes it's just that you are isolated. We saw in the third picture, we saw people in the Andes Mountains, the Quechua people, they are just isolated. They are on their own. And that keeps you culturally divergent. You don't have as much diffusion there, and so you are going to be different than other places, right? We saw that with the Maasai tribe. We saw that in how they still impress women by jumping up and down. These are things that culturally are not similar to anything else because they've been able to preserve it because of their distance away from other cultures. All right, so I'm not going to read through all of this, but you can see this comes from our notes on Eastern versus Western culture. The big ideas that we saw here, right? So the big things is that Eastern culture, our Asian cultures, not just East Asian, but we're talking Southwest Asia, talking about India and South Asia as well. We see the maintaining of traditions, of customs, respect towards elders, being less flexible in their beliefs. We also saw that maybe there's more respect towards bosses or towards teachers, not as much defiance or like interactive learning, right? We talked about some of those things. Whereas in Western culture, that would be North America, South America, Europe, those places we see more openness to express their feelings. People are looked at as an individual instead of which in Eastern culture we saw more of a collective idea. And you know, we talked about, when we read the other article that talked about Western culture has its history within the Greeks, right? The Greeks lived in the mountains. They had city-states that were kind of on their own. They did things like hunting that didn't need other people. And so they were able to kind of develop this idea of, I'm an individual. I want to do what I want. I'm going to argue for my side, right versus wrong. I'm right, you're wrong, right? With Eastern culture, especially with ancient China, we saw the large plains that are there, the physical geography, right? So lots of farmland. When you're farming, you have to work with other people. We saw more strict governments with dictators and with tyrants and with dynasties, and those things had more control than in the Western culture. So this idea of everyone is benefiting, we're working towards a collective goal, it's all about us as a group instead of as an individual, is very important in the Eastern culture. All right, so I'm going to go over monotheism and polytheism. Please remember that religions are going to believe what they do. Some religions are more towards monotheistic, some are more towards polytheistic. Some people disagree. Some people say that Hinduism is polytheistic. Some of them say it's monotheistic. So it's very difficult for us to say which is which. generally agreed upon are monotheistic religions believing in one God would be Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Typically, people also say Sikhism is monotheistic as well. Whereas polytheistic religions, you would have many gods. We sometimes see this within nature worship as well. All right, so I really encourage you to look over and read through your charts again. That was the whole reason why we did those charts, is for you to read that information and not just fill in the blanks. So I'm not going to be able to talk through all that information again. You need to go back through and read through those charts. With Judaism, we see the location is that there's concentrations in Israel. We do also see them in major urban areas. But generally speaking, Israel is the homeland of the Jews. They are monotheistic. They read the Torah. Jerusalem is in Israel and is their holiest city. They worship in a synagogue on Sabbath, and they fast during religious holidays. Christianity, also the God of Abraham, just like in Judaism, they are monotheistic. In Christianity, they believe that that Jesus is the Savior of the world, and by believing in him, you could attain salvation. They read their holy book as the Bible, and they worship in church on Sundays. Jerusalem is also important to them because it was the death place of Jesus. Islam, also monotheistic. They believe in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, who they believe had a special relationship with Allah. His teachings were written down in the Quran. And they worship in a mosque on Fridays. They have multiple holy cities. Jerusalem is important to them because the Dome of the Rock is located there, which is where they believe that Muhammad ascended into heaven to speak with Allah. Mecca and Medina are also important religious cities for them as well. All right, we have Buddhism and Hinduism on here as well. So Buddhism, we see this mostly in South India to Southeast Asia, China, Japan, so moving eastward on the Asian continent. This started with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. He was a Hindu prince, and he saw the suffering in this world. That was the Four Noble Truths. There's suffering, it has a beginning point, it has an end point, and the way you get out of that suffering and the endless reincarnations of your spirit would be to reach nirvana, which is following the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is things like the right speech, the right concentration, the right actions, living this middle way without being in the extremes to try to reach enlightenment. They do not worship Buddha as a god, and everything is about their own spiritual journey. Hinduism is older than Buddhism, right? So they believe that your karma determines your reincarnation, right? The good things you do in your life will help you have a better life in your next life. The bad things you do will come back to you as well. And the Dharma, which is your duty based on your previous lives, puts you into the caste system. Now, India does not, the government of India says that this is illegal. It still is practiced in rural areas that are more traditional. But that is the caste system, which was this ranking of people and what jobs you could have and who you could marry. It was based on their dharma. It's based on what they had done in their past life. All right, Sikhism. So Sikhism also is found in India as well as Hinduism, right? So northern India, the founder, Guru Nanak, believed that God created everybody equally, and there was no caste system, and that is the big point of Sikhism, is that everyone is equal. They still do believe in reincarnation, but there is one God for all people, so they are monotheistic. And then we have Shinto. We talked about Shinto a little bit. If you're having a hard time finding that in your notes, Shinto was on the Elements of Religion's notes on the front under animism, right? So this is nature worship, but they also worship their ancestors. It's about preserving traditions, keeping nature sacred. This is the indigenous or the original religion of Japan. And that's not our only animistic or traditional religion. We see these throughout any remote areas, isolated areas where objects of nature have souls and spirits, and it's practiced differently throughout the world. All right, so we're going to label the religions here. So our first one is Christianity. Christianity spread to North and South America from European colonization, and so that is the majority here in North and South America. We have Islam in Northern Africa. It diffused from Southwest Asia through the empires they had, and it was very easy to conquer through the Sahara. We also see Islam in Southwest Asia, in Saudi Arabia, Iran, that area. Please remember not to get Southwest Asia and Southeast Asia mixed up on your test. Always be careful if you're reading through that you're not reading the wrong directions on a map. We see Hinduism located in India, and we see Buddhism in East and Southeast Asia. So there's not an arrow there, but it also goes towards Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, just south of China. And then Shinto is our indigenous religion of Japan. And then our last one would be animism. So we see animism in some of those desert areas, rainforest areas, very cold areas, places where there's less people and less diffusion.